Good morning. Thanks very much, Mrs. McCain and President Crow, for another tremendous Sedona Forum, and for your continued leadership to bring together thought leaders to tackle not just the challenges of today, but to bring together those who have the vision to work toward addressing the issues of tomorrow. One of these key issues is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is threaded throughout all aspects of our lives, and the recent SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange events highlight the need for urgent action and change. This action and change can be prioritized into 4 categories. First and foremost, our nation must focus on the continued response, recovery, and remediation from SolarWinds. We saw swift action on the part of the Biden administration to bring industry and government together to address the immediate impact from the breach. But the recovery and remediation are still underway today, and we must ensure that we continue our focused response so that no foreign actor has access to our vital government networks. The SolarWinds breach exposed the vulnerabilities in our nation's supply chains. Our open economic environment means we are at an increased risk for malicious activities, and we know malicious actors will prey upon the weakest link. What does the federal government need to do to secure our supply chains, particularly those involved in our critical infrastructure? Should government and industry identify a set of standards that all businesses involved in infrastructure supply chains must meet? Should we reduce the number of components in these supply chains? How can we help small businesses, which have limited resources, be secure enterprises? We must be prescriptive and specific in developing standards for all components of our supply chains. A second priority is to facilitate improved government and industry collaboration pre-event. As a nation, we have proven to be very effective when we are responding to a catastrophe, natural, man-made, or digital. We bring all resources to bear. But we have to do a much better job preventing events, preparing for them, and in our real-time immediate response to them. Government and industry must work together pre-event to share information about sectors, to share actionable intelligence, nation-state activity, and cross-sector activity. We must also bring industry and government together to help plan for what we are not expecting, to stretch our imagination and plan for what we haven't seen. One of the primary weaknesses of our government detection, which led to the SolarWinds event, was that our systems were set to detect tactics our adversary had already used. The system was not set up to detect novel tactics, techniques, and procedures. Deliberate industry-government collaboration is critical to building a more resilient and secure infrastructure. Neither sector can do it alone. The third priority is to coordinate with our international partners to compel our adversaries to change their behavior. We should focus on offense and defense alike, but we need to do more when it comes to defense, and we cannot do it alone. The nominee for National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, recently said, "You have to beat all of us to beat one of us." We must identify consequences for bad actors, and we need to do so in collaboration with our allies and like-minded economic partners. Finally, we must focus on messaging and education and create a culture of security and safety in our country. We must change the behaviors of individuals to protect their personal lives and to protect the enterprises of which they are a part. We've had several attempts at awareness campaigns in cyber, but the challenge has been that we are focusing on too many issues, and therefore we're not effective at addressing any of them. We need to help individuals understand their responsibility and accountability for cybersecurity, what it means to have strong authentication, to understand what a phishing email or text looks like, and the importance of software updates. This approach may sound basic, but we are failing on these issues, and our adversaries are taking advantage of these vulnerabilities. An awareness campaign on the importance of strong authentication could go a long way in raising the bar. Cultural change is hard, but we have seen our nation succeed and change its behavior. A foundation of a culture of security and safety is critical in influencing the market and helping to prioritize security and safety throughout our digital economy. I'll now hand it over to Siobhan Gorman. I hope you enjoy the panel.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Siobhan Gorman. I am a partner with the Brunswick Group, a strategic communications firm, and I'm based out of DC, where I co-lead our cybersecurity, data, and privacy practice. With us today, we have 3 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee who have been tracking cyber issues as part of their oversight responsibilities. And today we will talk about the issues ahead on cybersecurity, particularly on Capitol Hill, but also for the nation and beyond. Today we have with us Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. Senator Reed is currently serving his 5th term in the Senate and recently became chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee after serving as ranking member since 2015. In addition to his position on armed services, Senator Reed is also a senior member of the Appropriations and the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. He's also an ex officio member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. In all of these committee assignments, cybersecurity is a major priority, particularly on armed services, which shapes cybersecurity policy and oversight for the Defense Department. We also have Thom Tillis of North Carolina. Senator Tillis is currently serving his 2nd term after being reelected last year and was recently named co-chair of the bipartisan Senate Cybersecurity Caucus. In addition to his role on armed services, Senator Tillis is a member of the Veteran Affairs Committee, Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, and the Judiciary Committee. He's focused on cybersecurity efforts as part of his role as ranking member on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Consumer Protection. And Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, captain, and now Senator Kelly is a retired Navy combat pilot, engineer, and NASA astronaut. He lives in Tucson with his wife, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. As a naval aviator, he flew 39 combat missions in Operation Desert Storm. And during his time at NASA, he flew 4 missions aboard the Space Shuttle. On December 2nd, Senator Kelly was sworn into the U.S. Senate to represent Arizona in our late Senator John McCain's seat. So we're very happy for him to join us. And he is focused on cybersecurity efforts through his service on both the Armed Services Committee, as well as his role as chair of the subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities. With that, I think we'll just go ahead and dive into questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll start with Senator Reed, but I'd love to hear from all of you on this. This is sort of the classic what's keeping you up at night question. As you see cyber threats on the horizon, what is keeping you up at night in terms of either what we're facing now or what you see over the coming months?
Well, I think one of the first issues is the incredible acceleration of innovation. We're in a race, just in some respects like the arms race, the Cold War, but now even quicker, even faster. And we have to make sure we win that race. With AI coming on, with quantum computing, all these things are going to be so disruptive. And the second aspect is the pervasiveness of the penetration of cyber into every realm of activity. Elections, financial institutions, social media, disinformation campaigns, et cetera. In fact, the first phase of any conflict today will be some type of cyber operation that'll develop, hopefully not into a conflict, but it'll be a significant challenge. And those are the 2 major issues.
Great. Senator Kelly or Tillis, did you want to add anything?
Well, I agree with everything Senator Reed said. I believe that the pace and the acceleration of tools that are available and at virtually no cost is unprecedented, and they're being used for malign purposes. We've seen some of, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, some of the major near-peer competitors, their malign activities, but also other nation states and organizations that are penetrating our infrastructure, penetrating our business infrastructure, potentially putting our supply chains at risk. And I think all of those are things that we have to act on. And we also have to act on that. We have to encourage the private sector to do their part.
Siobhan, let me just add that, one thing that I've always been concerned with is how we have adapted off-the-shelf software and off-the-shelf technology for the military and for our intelligence agencies. We basically buy software that, has a civilian version, and then we adapt it for intelligence services, for our government, for government agencies, for the Department of Defense. And that really concerns me. And I often think if we could go back in time, 20, 30 years in the past and rethink this, that we would probably create an architecture that doesn't have a civilian software equivalent, and that these things are just built much more securely. We can't do that now. But as we move ahead, and based on what Senator Tillis and Reed were saying, we've got, I feel we have to rethink this, and how much do we want to be, purchasing things that are, off the shelf.
No, that's a great point. And I want to get to the pandemic and its impact on cybersecurity, but then I will also come back to SolarWinds and supply chain attacks. So that's a great setup for the ongoing conversation. So as I mentioned, obviously we're still in a pandemic, and it has forced changes across all aspects of work, of government, of business. And we've seen in terms of the work that we do at Brunswick, where we help companies respond to cyber attacks, that there's been a huge surge in cyber attacks over the last year. So maybe we'll start with Senator Tillis, but what do you see as sort of the main impact the pandemic has had on the cybersecurity threats that we face?
Well, I think a key aspect of, as we shut down, rightfully so, when we were trying to get a handle on just how threatened the nation was going to be with the pandemic, we started remote work. We saw entire infrastructures that may have been within the corporate realm with a certain level of security you could assume with it now get dispersed throughout the United States. And you've seen a lot of good come from it. Telehealth is one example, parts of the infrastructure we need to harden and keep on. But every time you disperse technology outside of a confined area where you have a certain level of protection, you increase the risk. And what a lot of people don't understand about cyber threats are the latent threats. We think about SolarWinds, we could talk about Sony years ago. Those are the obvious threats, but cyber terrorists, malign actors have latent capabilities that are lying there waiting to be awakened. And we don't know to what extent, when we were in an unprotected environment, maybe with business assets, perhaps they used VPN, maybe they didn't, to what extent there's some latent threat that we will know about at some point in the future. Those are the sorts of things that we have to really get a better handle on.
That's a great segue into one of the latent threats that just emerged over kind of the December and January time period. That was when SolarWinds suddenly emerged, even though apparently the attackers there had been in SolarWinds and in other computer systems, maybe even a year or more before that. I guess, you're all on the committee that oversees DoD cybersecurity work. What has the SolarWinds attack taught us, and how should we apply these lessons? Maybe we'll start with Senator Kelly, because I promised him we'd come to it, but then let's go to Senator Reed and Tillis if you have something to add.
Well, 85% of our infrastructure is privately owned. And we have seen over the last several years, it's if you're a small, medium-sized business, 75% of them have experienced some form of cyber attack. 45%, I think, in the last year or so. And we often don't know when this happens. Private companies currently have a right to, keep that information to themselves. It makes it more challenging for the FBI and our intelligence agencies to see what the fallout has been, from these attacks. I know there's legislation that's being proposed to require reporting, but when the federal government can't find out that these attacks occur, it's nearly impossible to find out what the long-term implications of these are. Now, in some cases with government agencies, we do find out, and that's disclosed. Where I live in Pima County, Arizona, Pima County suffered a cyber attack. Unclear exactly what information was taken, but we know it happened, and the FBI can follow up. But that's not always the case, and that concerns me that we don't know the scale and the scope of these attacks from our adversaries.
Senator Reed, anything else to add on SolarWinds in terms of
Well, I
what
think
that's
Mark
showed
made
us?
an excellent point. I would just say we do not have a comprehensive defense against cyber attack. And as he alluded to, so much of our cyber is in the private sector without any requirements to report necessarily. And there, in fact, might even be reputational risks to reporting. So there's a disincentive rather than an incentive. But even within the government, we can't connect all the dots. We have Cybercom, which is a Department of Defense operation, but there are constitutional and legal limits as what they can do. Similarly, with the FBI, there are restrictions on what they can do with information. So one of our key problems, we are not coordinated, and in many cases, our adversaries, nation states as well as criminal gangs, are very well coordinated, and they're working with each other hand in hand, and that's a challenge that we have to face.
Is there something that Congress can do about that?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, as Mark suggested, there's legislation that's been proposed about reporting. Indeed, our financial regulators, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Comptroller, has published a potential rule that will require financial institutions to disclose significant cyber incidents. That would be very, very helpful. And then we can work on bringing everyone together. I must commend our colleagues, Senator Angus King of Maine and Congressman Gallagher of Wisconsin. They authored the Solarium report, which gave us great advice. And with Thom and Mark's help, we included it into many of the pieces into the Defense Act, but we have to do more.
I think Senator Kelly raised the issue of sort of supply chain challenges more broadly across DoD, and I know that has been something that I think certainly has been an issue on the Hill and at DoD and elsewhere for quite some time. Maybe Senator Kelly and then Senator Tillis and certainly Senator Reed, if you want to weigh in as well. As we look to strengthen our cybersecurity on the supply chain front, what are some of the industries we should be focusing on first?
Well, over the last year or so through this pandemic, we've had a shortage of semiconductor chips across the country. It's resulted in manufacturing of, some automobiles to cease. And we currently don't manufacture the highest quality semiconductors in the world. The 5 nanometer chips that are in a lot of our cell phones come from the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Understanding that the best technology now is available, just overseas is a national security issue for us. And that's why, we're working here in the United States Senate, across party lines to try to bring that manufacturing back to the US. But right now, if we were to lose the ability to get semiconductor chips that go in, into everything from phones to cars to our most sophisticated military weapon systems, and that is a threat to our national security. So making sure that those companies that provide this critical hardware has the necessary support they need to prevent, cyber attacks is a critical thing right now. But at the same time, we need that manufacturing, to come back to U.S. soil, and we're working on that. But for the chips that are currently made, we've got to make sure that those companies don't get hacked.
Senator Tillis, Senator Reed, any other industries that come to mind or on your radar for supply chain?
I've said this in a couple of Senate Armed Services hearing committee meetings. I was a partner at Price Waterhouse. I worked in the supply chain practice. I also worked in IT practice to do ethical hack testing, penetration testing for private sector company infrastructures. We have to understand the nature of the relationship between contractors and the Department of the Defense or the federal government writ large. You may have a prime contractor, but invariably they have a tail of either intermediate tier, low-end subcontractors that are critical parts of the supply chain. What we experience right now with cyber attacks are largely what you would consider analogous to an ambush. They're relatively isolated. They don't have a broad impact. But imagine a well-coordinated attack by a well-resourced terrorist organization or a nation state that took the time, most of the information in the public record, to create latent capabilities to disrupt the systems of the supporting suppliers to a major defense contractor. And at one time, flip a switch and cause that level of disruption, a disruption that could shut down possibly the delivery of major weapons systems. Those are the things that we have to do a better job of. How can we do it? First off, I think that we start by setting absolute standards for the prime contractor and all subcontractors on penetration and adherence to the standards. If you can't make the standard, then you can't be a part of a contract. But then we also have to go back to the point you were asking earlier. If Congress creates an environment where we set very specific guidelines, statutory guidelines for data breach, data ownership, I think that that will raise all boats in terms of securing these systems that we're going to continue to rely on. Just like Mark said, we're going to rely on the private sector for a lot of our IT systems, a number of other things. We've got to drive standards that harden the baseline products and services that we're getting from the private sector.
Well, I would just like to add is many times we don't know who is in our supply chain. Because we have a general contractor and then they have a subcontractor. That subcontractor is owned by one corporation that's owned by another corporation. So one of the things we have to do is really clarify the beneficial ownership. Who really is supplying us? And in the last National Defense Authorization Act, we required the Department of Defense through their major contractors to start tracing the actual ownership of companies. And we have to apply that principle to the private sector also. So legislation that would require, I propose, the divulging the beneficial ownership of private companies would also be useful. One of the great things we discovered in the pandemic is all our PPE was coming from China, and we thought it was coming from Omaha. You know?
Yeah, know your supplier, right? So Senator Reed, you mentioned this a little bit earlier when you were talking about what was keeping you up at night, and obviously we've come off another election cycle, and that came off seemingly without major cyber issues, and just as we were declaring victory, of course, SolarWinds was kind of happening in the background. But to what degree are you concerned about securing future elections? Do you see the threat evolving?
I think the threat will evolve. No, I think the threat will evolve. It's in 2016, we took very aggressive action, offensive action. We authorized that again in the National Defense Act. So Cybercom was very active. But in 2018, 2016 was not our best moment, but 2018. And then in 2020, there not seemed to be the level of engagement. But I think that's probably a conscious decision by the Russians and others not to get engaged. And again, I think that's not because they think it's bad. It's just because they're waiting, as Thom said, to have a latent impact on an election in the future. And so we have to be constantly on our guard in terms of the reliability of the vote, but more importantly, the whole disinformation campaigns that are run constantly. And that's going to be a challenge because most of it's in the hand of private social media companies.
Yeah, we got a lot better. One of the technological initiatives that Congress funded that made 2018 and 2020, the actual capture of elections more secure, was a listening device that we could work with the local elections boards and the Secretary of States in the state. If we saw anything that looked like a malign penetration event for their infrastructures, we were able to give them the information. That's why I think you heard officials say that the infrastructure was probably as good as it's ever been. What we did see a lot of evidence of, there was tampering in the election, but it was more social engineering. It was using social media platforms and other things to influence narratives and potential election outcomes. But I feel like we made great progress. We've got a few states that are still catching up, but the majority of the states answered the call, got within an architecture framework that made sense and made the underlying technology that captures ballots and up to and including adding ballot machines that are doing double book accounting, basically, so that you've got a manual ballot and an electronic ballot, which makes it more auditable. But those are the sorts of techniques that we need to apply to the whole of government, different circumstances, but the same sort of concept.
No, that's a great point. You both mentioned disinformation as sort of an emerging threat. And, we've seen, various states use that to quite some effect. I'm wondering where you see that threat going, because we certainly saw it emerge in stronger force, in prior to 2020 and even before that. I mean, we've actually worked with the state courts on these issues. So this is not something that is solely focused on elections, but just different arms of democracy. And so, where do you see that threat going?
Well, I think it's going to accelerate, especially when we consider which adversaries are currently using that. Russia substantially in prior elections, but going forward, when you look at the emerging threat from, if the Chinese were start to use disinformation the same level the Russians do now, just the ability to apply a massive number of bad actors, and they've done that to some extent. But that's my big concern. I think we've got to go to the social media companies and make sure that they are participating in a way with a big enough effort to combat disinformation. I mean, it can be a threat to our democracy.
Is there more that they can do, the social media companies?
Well, I think they can. I mean, it's a and we've got to, as members of Congress, we got to encourage them to do it. And if necessary, I think there's maybe some advice, some tools that we can assist companies in doing this job. But it's critical to safeguard future elections.
So thinking about other types of critical infrastructure, the financial infrastructure is obviously going to be essential to our post-pandemic economic recovery, as well as just sort of a core part of U.S. infrastructure. Senator Tillis, what cyber issues are you watching in the financial sector?
In the financial sector, obviously, data breach is a very important factor. Identity theft is another just increasing challenge. Billions of dollars every year lost due to identity theft, some recovered, some not. So I think that the underlying transactions, payment systems, transaction systems, we talk about the clearinghouse, which is a very reliable pay and settlement engine that's used by the majority of the banking industry. Those are the sorts of things that we have to harden. And they are ones because they affect the individuals directly. This is where we keep whatever we earn and whatever we save. I, for one, think that there has to be some threshold that the public has to be informed of data breaches. I think that by doing that, it's going to provide even added incentive, and not just for the big banks, which tend to be the most sophisticated, but for the regional banks, the credit unions, all these financial institutions have to rise to a standard that is going to be able to face off against a threat. The threat that we know today will be a fraction of the capabilities that we will know 5 years from now, just because of the accelerated pace. I also think, though, when we talk about financial identity theft, most of it is not a data breach for a financial institution. It's because somebody didn't do something right as an individual. They let a password get breached. They got lazy. They won't use two-factor authentication, a number of other things. So we've got to work on cyber literacy and to what extent every single American needs to understand how vulnerable they are. I brought this book in. I've had it for years. It's called Hacking for Dummies. And I'm very familiar with this book because it's a discipline I used to practice in management consulting. But I went through the first 180 pages and identified a number of things that you can download off the internet, get an account, and steal an identity. That's not a data breach as far as the financial institution is concerned, but it's devastating for the individual who's had their identity hacked.
Now, that's a great point.
I think a related point to that is that individuals should have much more control over their personal data, and that we should legislatively allow people to opt out of or require companies to get an affirmative response from the customer if their data will be collected. And I think actually most data should be sort of erased within 6 months, because frankly, most businesses are operating in a cycle that's less than that, and the data just accumulates. massive volumes of data going back. And it leads to some of the things that Thom suggested about how you can really expose someone unwittingly by that person.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. In fact, when we're responding to cyber incidents at companies, often data retention is something that will really get them. You know, why were we holding this data for 20 years? So I think that's an excellent point. Sort of looking at kind of other emerging issues, particularly as it has to do with security issues in the financial sector. I'd love to hear Senator Tillis's views on this, but others as well. You know, I mean, we just saw the IPO of Coinbase, and ensuring that cryptocurrency is being used in a safe and secure manner is obviously something that is important as well. So just wondering what security issues you're tracking when it comes to cryptocurrency, blockchain, things like that.
I think we've only got about 45 minutes for this discussion. That could go on for days. You know, quite honestly, it's the wild, wild west. And there's a lot of resources committed right now that really only have the faith and credit of the people who created the algorithms that serve as the basis for the cryptocurrency. You saw the movements with Bitcoin and some of its competitors over the weekend. Major shifts in the valuation of your deposits. Dogecoin is another one that's been interesting to watch. You know, I really think at some point, you've got the UK just this week talking about maybe producing their own, the government producing their own digital currency. We've got to look into this and take a look at the kind of consumer protections that we have in place for the banking system in the United States, which is the gold standard for banking systems. We may have to go back and take a look at this and see if some, at least moderate level of regulation and consumer protection goes into place. Because if you study the whole basis of cryptocurrency, it's really interesting. It's a cool algorithm that people buy into, and then they start creating value out of it. But its sustainability, particularly without any sort of oversight, is concerning to me.
Well, one of the things we're struggling right now institutionally is who would regulate it. Some of these are being proposed to be regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're considering if they should do that. If not, then it's a commodity, so it's the Commodities Futures Trading. So we have to get our act together. And one point that I think should be brought up, it might seem a bit far-fetched, is if these types of currencies displace the dollar or the euro, how can we have effective monetary policy? How can governments influence their economies by increasing or decreasing the supply of money? And that's a factor. It seems far-fetched, but you know, many things 2 years ago seemed far-fetched, like Bitcoin.
And in the case of Bitcoin, when it hits 21 million coins, I think,
Right.
You know, that's it.
The algorithmic limit.
Yeah,
Right.
it's the limit. And I think we all always have to be concerned for anything that goes from 30 cents per unit in value to $60,000 in value over a relatively short period of time. I think about 10 years. I mean, but that is incredible inflation in value, and you know what goes up quickly could go down quickly as well. And often the folks that are hurt by this are not you know, big institutions. It's not folks with a lot of resources. It's somebody who often has very limited resources. So, you know, I agree with, you know, Senator Tillis and Reed that this is something the government should be looking at. You know, how do we regulate this?
Yeah. Senator Reed, based on what you see from a number of vantage points, both Senate Armed Services, but also Senate Intelligence, what foreign adversaries are you most concerned about right now in cyberspace? I'd love the others' views as well, but I'd like to start.
Yes, well, the most sophisticated are the Russians, followed closely by the Chinese. And the Russians have demonstrated that, obviously, but their penetration of the 2016 election. They appear to be behind the SolarWinds hack. The Chinese, however, appear to be behind the Microsoft hack, which was more extensive and perhaps even more damaging. Following behind them are the Iranians and the North Koreans, who aren't as skilled, but they're determined and they are disruptive. And then, of course, you can't dismiss criminal gangs. And I think more frequently collaborations between criminal gangs and nation states. So in an ironic way, they think they're getting the best of both worlds. So those are, I think, the topography, if you will, of the threats that we're facing from nation states.
Senator Kelly, anything to add?
Well, China seems to have a very long view. I think their hack of OPM indicates that they've now gathered information on millions of government employees with the intention to use some of that information over a long period of time. And like I said earlier, I think, they have more resources than our Russian adversaries do. And, I think, long term, it's, to me personally, it's more concerning.
Senator Tillis, any other adversaries you're concerned about?
Well, I agree with the big five, and I also think transnational criminal organizations are a real threat. I mean, these are people that through drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking have billions of dollars. So they have the scale that they need to mount a threat and potentially as an agent to a bad actor that wants to be one step away from a nation state. One of the things I think we have to do is do a better job of policing and arresting malign activities on the internet. There are some, maybe a couple of examples, but I think we have to get to a point to where we can see, just as we have with the election systems, where we see a suspected malign activity. We may have to reach a point to where we don't wait for a data breach to create a cyber consequence for the person who's clearly doing something that's not consistent with the standard operating procedure. I think that's important. One other thing I wanted to mention is I also worry a lot about the infrastructure. I spent about 5 years in investor-owned utilities in the energy space, and I'm worried about our SCADA systems, the operational systems for infrastructure. There is a lot of work that needs to be done to harden our grid and harden our power infrastructure. That would be, if we go from the ambushes I talked about earlier to a multi-pillar attack. Mark would know more about that, serving in the military than me, but you know that that's a comprehensive, simultaneous attack. Infrastructure would be a key part of that while you're trying to destabilize other elements of the U.S. infrastructure. We have got to work on that, and that's a matter of federal and state policy.
No, I'm really glad that you raised that, and it's actually sort of an issue I've long been interested in. Back before I was at Brunswick, I was a reporter for many years covering a lot of these issues, and I first wrote about cyber spies and the electric grid back in 2009. And I'm sort of wondering, given that this is something that you all follow, why such slow progress? That we're still talking about largely the same set of issues, particularly as it has to do with infrastructure, electric grid, things like that, more than a decade later. Maybe Senator Tillis and others.
I think that, when I was flying operational missions off of an aircraft carrier, and certainly when Jack was on active duty, jumping out of airplanes, software wasn't a thing. I mean, it really wasn't. It wasn't a domain of, combat. It wasn't something that we had great concern over. As we move ahead, so this is a relatively, in the history of our country and the history of warfare, a relatively short period of time we're talking about, where this whole, cyber, systems and software become part of what, warfare and dealing with our adversaries is about. So I would argue we're pretty new at it. I mean, just a couple decades. We have to do better. We have to hold our adversaries accountable when they take actions against us. I think that's a key aspect this is software is relatively new, and it is it's something we really need to focus on with a higher amount of intensity.
Well, I think it also goes to our culture and to our history. I mean, the Constitution did not create the most efficient form of government. It was designed to prevent the accumulation of power by one entity. Now we're in conflict with countries that have consolidated their power in one person in some cases. And if you look at electric grids, they are regulated by state utility commissions typically. There is a FERC, which controls the federal, when you cross the lines, that's across the state, but that's a commission that I don't think we've invested a lot of resources in terms of cyber expertise or even given them the mission to be cyber aware. Now that's changing as the Department of Homeland Security is sensing the danger of this, but echoing Mark's point, this is moving pretty fast and we don't move, unfortunately, that fast many times.
Yeah, Siobhan, I think I served in the state legislature and Speaker of the House for 4 years. One of the things that I couldn't quite get done is this concept of creating a rate case to where you would marginally increase either residential, commercial, industrial rates to plow back into grid hardening, infrastructure hardening. I still think that we should do it. I think you could build a rate case that's a de minimis amount in terms of increased rates so that you have the source of funding. That's where you get tied up at the state level. I think that we also have so many different options now. When we were talking about grid hardening 10 or 15 years ago, we were only just beginning to talk about microgrids, distributed generation, storage. So now we have a number of other tools that will allow us to disperse some of the traditional impediments that we have to large-scale nuclear, fossil fuel, hydro generation, and a more distributed model. And in this case, a distributed model would be easier to ultimately harden over time, or technologically easier, providing you some redundancy and cutover. Those are the sorts of things that we've got to encourage the states to do. I, for one, want North Carolina to be an early mover, by the way, because I think the state that develops a reputation for the most impenetrable, safest grid is also a great economic development opportunity. And as we do that for the broader nation, it's better for the American economy.
Well, and the energy industry is certainly big in North Carolina, so that makes sense. Senator Reed, Senator Kelly raised an important point too when he was talking about sort of the need for consequences, right? And so that's something that also continues to be debated, particularly in defense circles, but elsewhere, in terms of, how effective is deterrence when it comes to actions in cyberspace? We recently saw the sanctions announced against Russia in the wake of SolarWinds, and it sounds like there are probably other things that are in the works on the deterrence front. But just wondering, what's actually effective when it comes to either deterrence or consequences for our adversaries in cyberspace?
Well, I think the most effective is kinetic action. We saw that in 2018 when Cybercom actually went and disabled Russian computer systems that were trying to invade our election, basically. But I think one other aspect we sometimes forget is that we have very few rules of the road. I think it would be extremely helpful if there was an international agreement about what is the red line. You can't cross this line, which would give our much more clarity to the situation and make it more justified to go in and on a consistent basis and use kinetic action if necessary. So that's, as I said, I think kinetic action, actually going in and in a colloquial sense, breaking something, is much more effective than simply, we're going to fine you for doing this. It's the difference between jail and a speeding ticket.
Yeah.
But at the times when we don't and we choose to do something else, I think one key aspect of that is to make sure we have our allies on board. Because what we've seen before when we've had, let's say, embargoes and, we've taken actions against other countries, if they can go somewhere else to get, let's say, the product that they were prevented from getting or the service, then it defeats the purpose of taking that action. So, a strong relationship with our allies when we can do stuff in concert is it's necessary.
Senator Tillis, any other thoughts on consequences against our adversaries for their?
Well, just back to what Jack said and Mark amplified, we have to demonstrate that there is a line. I think Jack's right in trying to define what that is. But when we can clearly see someone walking down the cyber street with a weapon about to use it, we either have to arrest them, or we have to counter them. And we have capabilities to do that, used it on a limited basis. Jack talked about the one with the Russian government. But if we build a reputation, look, we've still, even with the threats that we have from our near peer competitors, we're still far ahead of them. But we've all got to catch up. We're all far from the finish line. We just happen to be ahead in the race. While we have this measurable advantage, and along with what Mark said, the collective advantage with our NATO partners and our allies, then that's a threat that's going to be hard to counter if we're willing to use it in response to a malign activity.
You know, as our economy is ever more dependent on technology, and there was some reference to this a little earlier with the semiconductors discussion, but protecting IP is going to be increasingly critical. You know, Senator Tillis, I know that this is something that you've paid a fair amount of attention to, but it's not something that we hear about as much in the cybersecurity conversation. How big an issue is protecting intellectual property?
Oh, it's a critical issue. I love getting on committees. We reconstituted the Intellectual Property Subcommittee, and I was chairman and now ranking member. I love committees that don't get a lot of press coverage, but get a lot of work done. Intellectual property protection is critically important. China is one of the worst offenders. It's a public safety issue. It's destroying a lot of economic opportunities for inventors in the United States. It's even going to be more important now that, just to what Mark said, let's say that we continue to rely on the commercial sector for some of our baseline software. If we're not able to get to a point where we can have something that's unique to the Department of Defense, for example, we have got to be able to have very strong protections that could stand up to international review to make sure that we're protecting it, and maybe even add another layer for any kind of intellectual property that has a very clear nexus with national security. A lot of work that we have to do there. We've made progress, whether it's patents, copyrights, trademarks, but we've got a lot of work to do. And it's a great economic impact, and I also think it ultimately represents a national security threat.
As we sort of near the end of our time, I'd love to get all of your views, and maybe we'll start with Senator Kelly, on what you think Congress's priorities really need to be on cybersecurity. You know, are there any prospects for legislation actually passing this year? There's certainly a lot of discussion, but wondering what the priorities should be, and then what you actually think is likely to happen.
Well, last year, and I was part of this, I was sworn in December, but the NDAA had a number, 25 recommendations, I believe, that were incorporated that dealt with cybersecurity. We need to do more of that. And we need to consider that this is a domain that we're going to be operating in, that all of our services will be operating in for the foreseeable future. And, you know, just to mention a little thing something that Senator Tillis brought up, you know, about IP. I mean, if you just look over the last, 30, 40 years, I mean, this isn't a problem today. You go back and look at Russian airplanes from the 1980s and 90s, look very similar to what we built. The J-20 today has technology that comes straight from the F-35 from a cyber attack. And if and that puts our service members at risk from basically what we designed, what we innovated, designed and built here could potentially be used against them. It's up to us here in the United States Congress to deal with this issue, to make sure that doesn't continue to be a threat.
Senator Tillis, congressional priorities for cybersecurity this year, and what
I hope that we get to, we talked about it last year, but when you get into a multi-jurisdictional issue where you have commerce and judiciary, potentially even banking involved in data breach, data ownership, and data security, it gets a little bit more complicated. But I think there's an increasing interest in coming up with something that addresses all of those, including the ownership issues that Senator Reed spoke about. So that's something that I do believe has a chance in this Congress. We need to start, not go a la prima, maybe go a la carte, make some progress, and then build on it, see how it works, learn from some of the overreaches in the EU, some of the state laws that have been implemented. I think that's one that's achievable in this Congress. I think that the other one under Chairman Reed's leadership and the Senate Armed Services Committee, that to a point that he made earlier, we need full transparency and accountability in the supply chains. So not only the person we sign the contract with, but all the authorized subcontractors and inputs. We have to have full transparency in there and be absolutely certain that every link in that supply chain is secure. And that's something that Senator Inhofe focused on. Senator Reed, I've got full confidence in him and his leadership that we can make progress there as we move forward with the future NDA.
And Senator Reed, your priorities.
Well, I second what Mark and Thom have said. I think we need a more streamlined approach, more coordination between the different aspects of our response, our military response and cyber command, our response on the civilian side with Homeland Security, and our response with the law enforcement agencies. And we're working on that. That was a big part of what the committee did last year with the Solarium Commission. And something else I suggest, we need more workers. We have, if you look at critical agencies in the government, the number of people devoted to cyber issues is not as significant. You look at a major banking institution, they have literally sometimes thousands of people that are worrying about their operations. When you go to the comparable agency in our government, there's several hundred that are at the computers constantly. And so that's something else we need.
And you mentioned the Solarium Commission. It was really unfortunate timing that obviously they put their report out just as everybody was sort of, really kind of hit upside the head with COVID. Do you think that there's more that can be done to sort of elevate some of the ideas from the Solarium Commission now that people are sort of trying to figure out, okay, what does normal look like, at least toward the end of hopefully the pandemic?
No, I think we have to do that. And we will be doing that in the committee deliberations this year. And then we have to call on others besides the Solarium Committee and Commission. There are lots of innovative thoughts in industry, in academia, and we'd like them all so we could pick the best and move forward with it.
Great, and I think that's an important thought to end on. I'd just love to get any final thoughts from Senators Tillis and Kelly on, are there ideas now in circulation, maybe not on the legislative side yet, but sort of other ideas that you're hearing that you think need to be elevated, need to be really part of that discussion? Maybe Senator Tillis?
Yeah, I think our work in the Cyber Caucus, we've got to increase our own understanding of the nature of the threats among members of Congress. There are varying degrees of understanding depending upon what committees you serve on, if for no other reason. I think that we have to bring more experts in to look at the emerging threats. We don't want to just focus on the threats that we know them today, but the trends that are 3 years, 5 years out that will be serious threats, and then try to convince our members in areas where I do think that we need to act. I talked about data breach, data ownership, data security. Obviously, hardening the whole of the federal government's very important. We need to break it up into bite-sized chunks and then make that become legislation and subsequent regulations that we can act on and make our very, very important internet infrastructure far more secure than it is today.
Senator Kelly, any final thoughts?
Education. We need an educated workforce on cyber. We need to be getting kids out of high school, technical schools on this issue, also into college, and come out the other end to be the professionals, to work at companies, to protect these systems and work for the federal government. Our adversaries, are educating their young people in these areas. We've got to focus on it here too.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.